Before they were BRIC, no one really cared about who was running the show in Brazil, Russia, India, or China. But that's changed today. A new INSEAD study ranks 400 CEOs of Indian companies, and joining us today on INSEAD Knowledge is the lead researcher of that project, Professor Balagopal Vissa. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here, Mrinalini.
Who is number one on your list, and what criteria did you use to evaluate?
So the number one on our list was Naveen Jindal. He's a relatively young CEO of a company called Jindal Steel and Power, which is the most valuable steel company today in India. Naveen took over his company when he was quite young. He came to the situation with an MBA degree from UT Dallas, I believe. And he was also not, he took over the company in a situation where it was failing and then turned it around pretty well. And how did he turn it around? Fundamentally, he secured access to raw materials. It was a steel company. He ended up getting preferential access to raw materials, iron ore, coke, power, and so forth, in a context where others were not paying as much attention to those fundamental inputs, and therefore he was able to get them relatively cheaply. And when those commodities started rising up, and the prices were rising up in the global markets, Naveen's company had access and to really good quality raw material at reasonable prices, and that is the key element of the turnaround story. The perspective we took was that the most objective way to evaluate the performance of a CEO is to look at the total stock shareholder returns the CEO delivers over the entire tenure of that person's reign at the helm, if you will. So that was the fundamental criteria. So, and then specifically we looked at country adjusted shareholder return, and then we looked at industry adjusted returns, and then we also took the change in market cap after adjusting for inflation and so forth, and then ranked the CEOs on these specific criteria and then took the average rank.
What are some factors that increase the likelihood of an executive doing well?
Youth and education both seem to matter. Specifically, an MBA degree seemed to matter in terms of doing better on our list. In addition, what we find is that CEOs who took over in a context where their predecessor was not doing so well, that had a big advantage. So that we called it the runway effect. So CEOs who took over from a poorly performing predecessor are more likely to do well in our list. So those are the CEO attributes. Then we looked at the type of firm or organization that the CEO is leading. Again, in India, we must remember there are three very distinct types of organizations. On the one hand, you have the familiar ones, the subsidiaries, the foreign multinationals operating in India. Then you have these often family-oriented business groups, again, private enterprises like the Tatas and the Reliance in the group and the Birla group and so forth. And then we also have a big state-owned sector, state-owned enterprises. Now, these are very different types of organizations. Two things which stood out. One was CEOs who were running state-owned firms were systematically likely to do worse in our list. Whereas there was no real difference between Indian private sector enterprise and the foreign multinational. And those are actually two very interesting sets of results. We don't find any specific sector dominating in the top 25 compared to the overall sample.
Your research found that youth matters. Younger CEOs perform better than more senior executives. What's the basis for your conclusion, and what role does experience play?
There are multiple different things that may be going on, right? One is that, yes, we do find that individuals who become CEO when they're younger, they tend to do better in the ranking. That could be simply because that they're very high quality to begin with and therefore rapidly rose through the ranks. And maybe the experience thing which you're referring to is maybe something like a threshold effect. You do need experience, you need to have a certain amount of experience, and beyond that, probably experience doesn't add as much value.
IT has been a high-profile industry for India, yet there's not one CEO represented in your top 25. Why is that?
The usual suspects, right? We would expect Narayana Murthy to be on that list. We'd expect, for example, Azim Premji to be on that list, but they never even entered our sample. The reason is we started our sample study window from 1995 onwards. It turns out that Azim Premji and Narayana Murthy became CEOs of their companies way before that 1995 window. So they were not even in our sample, although we suspect they would have done really well had they been included.
You've looked at leadership over a 15-year span. To what extent do you see successful entrepreneurs and new companies?
In the overall sample, about 5% of our sample we classified as CEOs who were also the founder entrepreneur. Like Sunil Mittal, for example, who's in our top 25, is the founder entrepreneur of Bharti Airtel. Is that 5% too low or too high? It's difficult to judge, right? Because of a number of things. One is that over the last 15 years, India has seen an explosion in terms of entrepreneurial startups, but India's also got now a really good ecosystem around entrepreneurship. So many of these successful small startups become big and then get acquired by other incumbents. So we see a lot of trade sale activity. So these entrepreneurs never even make it to our list because they don't even IPO their company. And secondly, the entrepreneurs who do IPO their company, maybe they no longer, they move away from the CEO role and hire in professional new people as CEOs. There's a bit of that going on as well. And in many ways, I see this as a good sign, because in the past, Narayana Murthy had to run his company even after it became a large established company. So he had to learn many new skills all the way from, starting up from nothing to running a billion-dollar enterprise. It's very difficult for most people to learn and adapt along the way, right? So it's very important to have an ecosystem where entrepreneurs build a company from 0 to 100 million or to 200 million, and then they exit their company and somebody else takes it to the next stage.
Where are Indian leaders systematically failing?
One of the strong things that comes out in our sample is that CEOs, leaders who are running state-owned enterprises, they're systematically at a disadvantage. So somehow the Indian state needs to provide a milieu at the top of these public sector units, the state-owned enterprises, so competent people could thrive and actually drive shareholder value. Now that's a huge challenge.
Professor Visa, thank you for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Pleasure.